This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is scientism. Is it a good thing? What is it? And how does it affect culture and science? This show features two men who are going to be talking about what scientism is. Is it a good thing? How does it affect society and science? On the left is Stephen Lehar. On the right is Tom Sorrell. And they both have different opinions about what it is. So, as I usually do, let me just give a few minutes to both men to introduce themselves. Stephen Lehar, if you could take a few minutes, give a little bit of biographical background, what your belief about scientism is, good or bad, and how you came to that belief.
Well, I am an author. I wrote a book on consciousness. I have a deep interest in science and in scientism, and I wrote a book called Scientism, a system of ethics based on reason without recourse to supernatural belief. And I have a somewhat different definition of scientism than what is normally criticized. The criticism of scientism is that it does not acknowledge any other method of reasoning, and that's not my scientism. My scientism is I happen to believe that science is a good way of addressing problems, including problems that are normally not in the scope of science. And that belief does not exclude other belief systems. I still believe in math. I still believe in art and humanities. I believe in emergence and emergent processes in the brain. But I do believe that science is the most promising way to pursue most any subject, even those subjects that have not been traditionally dealt with science.
Do you, what is your thought on the scientific method and falsifiability? Do you think that science is science if it's not falsifiable?
Well, a lot of people have a very restrictive understanding of science. The logical positivists, that you have to be able to demonstrate and prove every single statement. I don't believe in that kind of restrictive science. For example, my belief in scientism, my faith in science as a method, is itself not a scientific conclusion. Yeah. It's an intuition that I have based on the historical success of science in dealing with these different issues. But my belief in science is not a scientific conclusion. It is a belief, and it's a belief that's arrived at by an intuition that is not scientific.
Okay. Tom Sorrell, can you give a definition of your view of scientism and also a bit of your background?
Sure. I'll start with my background. I'm a philosopher. I teach at the University of Warwick. I'm a professor of politics and philosophy. I'm a Canadian. I was born in Mexico. I was brought up in Vancouver and Montreal, and I went to graduate school primarily at Oxford. I started thinking about scientism probably at the end of the 1980s, and I wrote a book called Scientism, Philosophy, and the Infatuation with Science. And more recently, I've written a book called Descartes Reinvented, where I've tried to show that some elements of Cartesianism are well represented in the kind of analytic philosophy that's officially anti-Cartesian. I think Descartes had some good views about science and metaphysics and wasn't scientistic. So what I mean by scientism is the view that a method that one finds primarily in the natural sciences and probably in the hardest of the natural sciences is a model for inquiry of every kind. And my response to that is to say that that's incorrect, but not because I think the scope of science is small. It's just that it has limits. So scientism, I think, is the view that science applies where, in my opinion, it doesn't. And I'll give you just a couple of places where it doesn't apply.
Good.
It doesn't seem to me to apply to ethics. Uh-huh. And it doesn't seem to apply in the explanation of mathematics itself. It doesn't apply to some metaphysical questions. Those are areas where it seems to me the problems are genuine, the questions are genuine, but the methods that are needed to answer them are not ones that would be taken from the hard sciences broadly conceived at all.
So, Tom, regarding ethics, say you wouldn't subscribe to the fact that ethics is solely based upon evolutionary principles of what is good for the individual, the way it would be laid out in Darwinism.
No. What I think is that there may be some evolutionary mechanisms that favor cooperation, for example, or the coordination of behavior, but there's a lot more to ethics than the coordination of behavior, and there's quite a lot more to ethics than issues that that promote survival. For example, it might be perfectly coherent to talk about a code of honor in which suicide was an excellent outcome, and even where it was a great honor to die as a martyr. You get my sense of what I might be alluding to here. Maybe ideas in both Japan and currently in some parts of the Middle East. Those are ethical schemes that we would disagree with, perhaps, but they make sense as part of an ethics that's connected with, say, a military code of honor. And I think those sit uneasily with evolutionary theory.
So just to differentiate between you and yours and Stephen's ideas, Stephen basically is saying that, if I read him correctly, that scientism as a word has been corrupted to mean something negative when it should be something viewed as positive, whereas you would take the view that scientism, as it's practiced, is bad science. Is that correct?
It's overextended science.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Stephen, did I define your?
Yes, that was correctly characterizing my position. On the issue of military code of honor and suicide killing, if you belong to a nation or a group that beats another nation or group, where individuals have to sacrifice their lives in order to win that victory, then as a collective, as a group, that was of evolutionary advantage to the individuals, and that is why we see self-sacrifice of that extreme sort in human behavior, because it does have an evolutionary impact when one group totally annihilates another group and they are the survivors.
Well, Dan, if I could just reply briefly to that. It's not that you can't tell such a story. It's not that you can't say that there's an evolutionary purpose that this self-sacrificial behavior might fit, but it's perfectly intelligible for someone to talk about a code of honor that's quite individualistic and militaristic, that where military activity is not for the sake of a particular country so that it's detached from the survival of a community, but it's simply a set of rules. In the case we're discussing, it's a set of rules for how soldiers, military people, perhaps men in some pointed sense of men behave. And that's the reason why it'd be better to commit suicide than surrender, or something like that. So I think one has to, so to speak, stipulate some underlying communal purpose for evolutionary theory to get a purchase here.
Yes, right, exactly. Well, I was reading some of your other stuff, and I heard you say purely self-interested behavior contrasts with moral behavior. Not because morality is self-sacrificing. The reasons why people do things that are moral shouldn't be connected with reasons of self, but with more general concerns. So you were making a distinction between cooperation and altruism, and you were making the point that altruism cannot be justified by evolutionary theory. And I would contest that, because I think the distinction between cooperation and altruism is a distinction between evolution of traits that immediately reward the individual versus the evolution of traits that reward the individual indirectly only by the mediation of the collective to which they belong. So, for instance, if you selfishly kill people and steal their stuff, you will get a quick benefit of fast money, but then society will catch up with you, and in the long term, it will be, again, against your self-interest. And therefore, there is actually a selfish benefit to the collective behavior, even of altruistic behavior, although it is an evolution of a benefit to the society as a whole, not to the individual.
Yes, I see how that kind of position can be stated, but I think where we disagree is in the definition of altruism. So I think you make altruism a matter of whether you get a reward or not, whether it's immediate or not, and whether the reward might implicitly be a reward to the community rather than to yourself, so at least the gene pool survives or something like that. Whereas I think of altruism as a matter of the kinds of reasons for action that there are, when the reasons for action maybe talk exclusively about the welfare of other people, and those reasons are taken to be sufficient for doing something, even if in fact nobody acts. They're good reasons, maybe even decisively good reasons for acting. That's what altruism is. So it may be that one of the reasons that we disagree is that I'm thinking about altruism in the way that some philosophers do, where it's just it's a theory of a certain kind of reason that we don't want to eliminate in philosophy just for the sake of squaring or making a neater story that can be told with evolutionary theory. But it's not that I'm terrifically hostile to evolutionary theory. I just think it's not going to be able to explain all aspects of morality. It might explain quite a few reasons. It might explain benevolence up to a point, but it wouldn't explain, in my view, altruism. Some kind of benevolence does reward both the doer and other people, but I would say altruism might be a bit different from that.
There are extreme examples of altruism where there's no benefit at all. For example, when the Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima were hopelessly outnumbered and surrounded, many of them stayed by their code of honor and killed themselves rather than be taken prisoner. I would say that that was irrational and immoral behavior because it did no good whatsoever to the individual soldier and it did no good whatsoever to the Empire of Japan. So when you kill yourself for no good reason, that is actually, in my view, immoral because it doesn't make any sense. And that is altruism taken one step too far. If, on the other hand, you embark on a very dangerous mission that will help your group against the enemy and you have a chance of survival, that's a different matter altogether. But I think that evolutionary theory is a way to demonstrate why that kind of extreme altruism is wrong. It's evil. It's not right. It's not good for anyone.
Well, Stephen, before Tom says something, let me just throw in here, since this is an unexpected. I didn't expect to go to the Japanese role in World War II, but you know that I think as the Allies got closer to mainland Japan, even citizens started throwing themselves off of cliffs because they had heard of the American atrocities coming. And wouldn't that, though, be more explained by the fact of mass delusion or propaganda? And sort of group psychosis rather than being immoral?
Well, you see, I believe in a pragmatic morality, that what is moral is what works. And that kind of philosophy does not work. It's not good for the Empire of Japan. It was not good for its citizens. And by evolutionary theory, you could say that whole system stank to high heaven because it was not good for the people who were members of that collective. And that's why I see that there's hope for evolutionary theory to answer questions of morality that are otherwise just out in thin air.
Okay, well, Tom, let me let Tom respond, and then we'll move on. Go, Tom.
Right. I just wanted to respond briefly. I think where the disagreement comes is when Steve's talking about, whether there's a good reason or what good comes out of something that's being done. And that's a perfectly intelligible idea, that morality is about benefit and welfare, and if there isn't any, then what's the point? That's a perfectly intelligible view, and it squares with quite a lot of utilitarianism, for example. But I think that there are still concepts that we have that make it understandable for us what it's like just to do something because it's right, even where there's no immediate benefit to anyone. So, for example, suppose that Earth is going to be hit by a big piece of space debris, and we're all, or many of us are going to be killed. Um, so a lot of ethical requirements that we now observe might suddenly start to look pointless. Yes, but somebody might still say that there's no good reason, and a lot of reason not to rape people, even though we're all going to die off in about 2 hours. Do you see what I mean? There are still going to be some things where if we indulged in them, we might get benefit in the form of pleasure, but there might still be good moral reasons why they weren't things we should do, namely the harm they do to other people, or the status of the rules that we're breaking when we break them. And if you think about those kinds of cases, which are troubling for evolutionary theory because we're positing the end of humanity, or maybe the end of all species on Earth, or something like that, when we think about it like that, we still have a kind of foothold for some kinds of reasons that detach themselves from benefit to groups of people or individuals. It seems to me.
Well, Stephen, do you just have a quick response?
Yes, I think there is a clear evolutionary explanation of that situation, because we have not evolved to face the end of the world, and therefore when we do face it, we cannot feel totally unconstrained by our instincts that have driven us up till now, and we haven't been raping people up till now, and there's no reason to start now. It would make us feel bad to do it, and so you don't need an independent system of ethics that floats disconnected from reality. There's an evolutionary explanation for why we continue to behave the way we do, even when it's not rational anymore.
Well, just let me come back really quickly on that, because look, suppose that we're about to be hit by the piece of space debris, and we are all convinced evolutionary theorists, right? So we say these instincts that we have against raping people, these belong to a set of impulses and drives that we have that make us survive, or that help us to survive. But look, guys, it's curtains now, so we can see through the basis of our instincts. And now, because it's futile, so to speak, to act in accordance with these evolutionary drives, all bets are off, and we can do what we like. You see, it still seems to me that there would be bases in our concept, so to speak, for thinking, maybe that's not all okay, even if we're convinced evolutionary theorists.
Okay, well,
that was clear.
Well, let me just. I mean, we could go on for an hour on a show on ethics, and I'll probably do a show on ethics and morality sometime and contact you both again. But I wanted to get on to some other instances of scientism, especially what prompted me to do this show, and that is I've thought that, for example, science writing has been in a golden age. I'm from the arts, and I think arts of the last 30 or 40 years has been just bad. But science has been, and science writing has been one of the golden spots there. But I still think that a lot of scientists are very sloppy with words. And I want to give two examples that I think are what I would consider scientism. I recently was going to interview a well-known physicist, and unfortunately, the interview didn't pan out because she had some issues with her computer. But in talking with her, the first issue was about mathematics, which Tom had said was he thought outside the purview of science. And for me, mathematics is not science. There's no way to rationally prove it. To me, mathematics is a language, the way that musical notation is, or any written language is verbally, to connote ideas. She argued, though, that mathematics was real. And I asked her, if she could provide any proof of it, and she couldn't. But to her, that mathematics was, if not a science itself, in the framework of science. So my question to both of you, and I'll go with Steve and then Tom, is one, do you think mathematics is a science? And two, if not, is that an example of scientism by taking something that's merely a language and not physical reality? Because she thought mathematics was reality rather than a language to describe reality. So Stephen, your thoughts first.
Very interesting issue. I have written on this subject, the question of the ultimate nature. What is mathematics? What actually is it? Is a very, very interesting question. And most people do believe as your scientist friend did, that math has some kind of objective existence somewhere in the universe outside of human minds, and that if all people died, the math would still survive. And yet there's no way to detect math anywhere in the universe. There's no way that it manifests its presence except in human minds. Well, I propose that mathematics is nothing other than an extension of the principles of perception, the way we perceive things in terms of their symmetry and regularity and straightness and good continuation, that the principles of perception are manifest in math, and that is the true nature of math. It does have physical existence in the universe, and it exists inside the human mind, where it will ultimately be detected as something that really exists in the physical universe.
Tom?
Well, I think that the way that you approach this question is by asking, for different kinds of statements, what makes them true? So, we can ask about the statements of arithmetic when they are true, what makes them true? Do we have to posit numbers, for example? And, there are lots of different positions in philosophy about whether we have to posit the reality of numbers or not, whether we can reduce numbers to sets or something like that. Even when you do that, those kinds of reductions, you're still left with the question, well, what about the reality of sets? And then there are often programs to eliminate even sets so that we come down to some familiar types of objects. A lot of those reductions are extremely artificial. They look like desperate measures just to reduce maths to something that we find relatively unproblematic and natural, and so on. But I think that begs the question. I think if you assume that the kind of thing that makes mathematical statements true has to be the same as the kinds of things that make statements of observation true, then of course, you might be tempted to say what Steve does and to say, well, it's a kind of it's connected with perception, or it's a projection of perception. My inclination is to say that whatever makes mathematics true is going to be an autonomous realm. Then I'm going to not go very much further than that. But what I want to say is something like this. If we look at physics, the hardest science of all, it's sort of shot through with mathematics, you see? I mean, we can't possibly do physics without mathematics. But I don't think anybody would say that physics explains mathematics, that, there's some story about matter that tells us why, Peano's axioms are correct, and why proofs of the truths of arithmetic are correct. There's that kind of asymmetry between the dependence of physics on mathematics and the independence of mathematics from physics. And that's, I think, something that's not regularly enough addressed. It is addressed in philosophy of mathematics, and there are people called Platonists who think that not only numbers, but other kinds of mathematical entities are real. And I'm sympathetic to those because they answer a good and genuine question in mathematics, which is, what makes mathematical statements true? And they do it in a way that doesn't exhibit as much strain as other more artificial naturalistic answers. But that's what we're talking about. There's a good question we start from, which is, what makes mathematical statements true? That's fair game for everybody. And the challenge is for anybody to come up with an answer that makes sense of the whole of mathematics. I'm suggesting that you probably can't by saying that what makes mathematical statements true is the same as what makes observation sentences true, or statements about physics true.
Well, Tom, let me just ask you then, do you think that if, let's say, hypothetically, there was an alien intelligence, be it artificially created by human beings or naturally arising in some other planetary biosphere, and they developed senses that match their surroundings, could they not have a totally different set of mathematics that could maybe be not as explanatory as ours is in certain ways, but also explain holes and gaps in ours, and that by parallaxing an alien's mathematics with human mathematics, that you could get a fuller picture of reality?
Well, I'm pretty sure that there could we already know that there can be alternative logics and deviant logics, and these are things that can be made pretty good mathematical sense of. And I certainly agree that other species could develop understandings of nature that are different from our mathematics, but they might have some common ground, so to speak. In other words, there might be some truths that belong to each of these systems that we could have in common. I doubt that there could be an applicable mathematics in one part of the universe that couldn't apply in another. I doubt that, but that's compatible with quite a lot of evolutionary difference and quite a lot of differences in the development of mathematics. I mean, if we compare ourselves with mathematics in the 14th century, we've obviously got a much more elaborate mathematics now than then. So we know that these differences in development of mathematics are possible from our own case. So I agree with that, but I wouldn't want to say that the currently developed mathematics necessarily contradicts the mathematics of our ancestors, even though the mathematics of our ancestors was primitive.
Okay, Stephen, do you have a reply?
Yeah, the question of whether alien intelligences would have the same mathematics really is very difficult to answer unless you have an answer to what is mathematics. And if you believe that it is some kind of objective, external, non-material thing, then the question is, how does a mind, whether alien or human, make contact with this immaterial thing? Whereas if you take the assumption that mathematics is a product of the way our mind works, it's an artifact of how we make sense of reality, and it works very well. Obviously, mathematics is such a great model of reality that I would presume that alien intelligences would have stumbled on the same perceptual principles, and thus they would have discovered the same math. But this is, I can't prove this. It's a belief of mine based on my scientism, in which I believe that science will ultimately explain all these things. It's not a scientific statement. It is a belief of mine. It's a belief system, and I just happen to believe it. It makes sense to me.
Yeah. I think when the 17th century, when the philosophers in the 17th century talked about the independence of some kinds of physics from the senses, that's something that Descartes talked about, and it's certainly something that we all believe in now. We don't believe that a lot of the truths of physics are even accessible to the senses that we have. That's to say that the truths of human physics are sort of beyond a sensory understanding. When people thought that at first in the 17th century, they thought that it might be that what was common to us and creatures on other planets, and indeed what was common to us and God, might be a particular understanding of nature that was mathematical and independent of the senses. So I think this idea that mathematics is kind of sense independent, that people with different senses could agree on some of the mathematical properties of objects, that idea actually suggests that we might have a species-independent purchase on nature to the extent it's mathematical. So I think that goes some way toward being on your wavelength, Dan.
Well, let me end this first segment with a final question that deals with more the real-world application of science and possibly scientism. And then the next segment, I want to talk a bit more philosophically. But in this conversation that I had with the physicist, after we had discussed mathematics, or attempted to, I turned to the subject of dark matter and whether or not it exists. And as you may know, and as viewers may know, dark matter is the hypothesized either macro or micro particles or things that account for what they claim to be missing mass. And she had claimed that, well, dark matter has been proven scientifically because, the stars at the outer edge of a galaxy are rotating too fast. There has to be, mass there that's pulling them along. And now for 40 years, that's been the basis. And I said, well, that's not a proof of dark matter. That's a proof that there's some effect that you are measuring. And I said, It could be that they are microscopic particles, subatomic particles yet discovered. It could be planets or brown dwarfs that we just can't see, or other matter in between. And we got stuck on that. Her saying that, well, if there's proof that dark matter. I said, no, dark matter. It's called dark matter because we don't know what it is. And so to me, that was her unwittingly practicing or tripping into a scientific belief rather than a scientific belief. So let me ask. Well, I'll start with Stephen and then Tom again. Was her claim that dark matter has been proved? As far as I know, it hasn't. As from what I just said, was that an example of the bad scientism that we've spoken of?
Dark matter and its cousin dark energy are the biggest fudge factors ever in science. And that's all they are. They are giant fudge factors. We have unexplainable phenomena, and so we put an equation term in there that accounts for it, and there's dark matter and there's dark energy. But the problem with the dark matter and dark energy theory is that supposedly 90% or more of the universe is composed of this dark matter and dark energy. And that means that our physics, the standard theory, only explains a tiny fraction of the universe. There's something fundamentally wrong there. And you are right that her assertion that this observation proves the existence of this stuff that is undetectable is not a scientific statement. That is a misapplication of science.
Tom?
Yeah, I don't think of it as scientism, what she said. I think what's going on is this. You've got a physics that's pretty successful, that predicts lots of things correctly over a wide area. And then there are some measurements that are made that can't be explained using what we've got so far of physics. And people postulate dark matter to accommodate the difference between what our physics, as it's so far been developed, predicts and what needs to be, the apparatus there needs to be in physics to accommodate this stuff, to accommodate the measurements. Now, I think all we're talking about is some kind of schematic hypothesis so far, but putting that hypothesis to explain the failure of our physics as we have it to accommodate all the measurements there are doesn't seem to me to be scientific. It seems to me to be scientific. Of course, how much evidence there is for dark matter as it's posited by this attempt to patch up ordinary physics, how far we've got toward establishing that it's actually real, I guess we haven't got very far yet. And that's your point, Dan. But I think the idea that we could posit such a thing as dark matter doesn't seem very illuminating to do that so far. But the move of doing so, that doesn't seem to be criticizable. That seems to me to be okay scientific procedure and not a case of scientism.
Well, the reason I bring that up though is her sort of blanket acceptance of what I thought was just poor logic goes beyond that. For example, I've done a series of shows interviewing some physicists on whether the multiverse exists, which is, various ways there could be a different Tom Sorrell in some other similar universe. And basically my argument, and this wasn't with her but with someone else, was that, and I asked all the people that I interviewed about it, is this idea of, for example, the quantum multiverse, that every binary decision you make splits the universe. I have objections to that because I don't think that everything is binary. But if one were to posit that if you sneezed in 5 seconds or didn't sneeze, that there are two Tom Sorrells, one who sneezes and one who doesn't, my claim would be, well, where does that whole energy and all the mass and matter of that second universe that splits off come from? Because as far as I know, matter can be neither created nor destroyed. And all three of the multiverse people, for example, said, oh no, that's just a hypothetical universe. It's just out there sort of in the quantum foam. It doesn't exist until we could experience it. And I'm saying, well, then what you're saying is that's not really real. It's not a real, when you say that's just a hypothetical possible universe, that's not really real. There isn't really, billions of Tom Sorrells from every decision that you made in your years on this planet. And it's that kind of use of very bad language and not knowing the consequences of what they're putting out and enumerating through what they're stating, whether it's concerning dark matter or multiverses. That's what I think leads to scientism in the public mind and gets to these, silly science fiction films or things where, there's a good Tom Sorrell that's, a serial killer, or and then there's a bad Tom Sorrell who's a serial killer in the universe next door.
Yeah, but aren't you? I think you're making very good points that these physicists have to answer. But I think all you're saying is that on the theory they're proposing, the multiverse theory, there are lots of questions they have to answer. They multiply questions that are hard to answer rather than answering a lot of the questions they postulate, and that counts against the theory. I don't know that that's a problem in logic. That's a problem in how complicated the theory is and how plausible it is. But you're able to make that objection using precepts that are recognized in science already. If you have a very complicated explanation for something that doesn't need to be so complicated to explain the phenomena, then it's a worse explanation than a simpler one. And maybe the point you're calling attention to is that the multiverse theory is a lot more complex and implausibly complex than it needs to be. But that's not the charge of scientism. That's the charge of explanatory extravagance or overcomplication or something like that.
So you don't think scientism, as you would define it in a negative sense, is something that's based off just, say, the offhanded errors of explication that a scientist might make? It's something fundamentally deeper.
Yes, I think it is deeper. I think it's the attempt to say that all questions can be answered that way. So,
Okay.
To give you an example of a scientific physicist, Stephen Hawking is a scientific physicist because he thinks philosophy is dead, and all the questions that philosophy has ever asked, we might as well start from scratch with them because philosophy is a hopeless way to deal with them. I think that's probably philosophically ignorant, but it's not that I think Stephen Hawking is not smart enough to do philosophy. I welcome him to our set of problems. That's fine with me.
Stephen?
Yeah, well, I think maybe a closer example of scientism, inappropriate scientism, is the Big Bang Theory, and how a lot of people connected with, well, that must be God at the other end of it, because what else could have caused the uncaused cause? And that would be what I would call misapplied scientism.
Yeah. I know I've had problems with the Big Bang myself because, and I'm going to actually try to do a show on nothingness because I think human beings have some problems with big abstract ideas like deep time or nothingness, because even when people say, well, before the Big Bang there was nothing, but it had potentiality. Well, potentiality is not nothing because we can name it. Nothingness, for example, isn't blackness. When people think of nothingness, they think of blackness. No, that's not nothingness. That's blackness. That's still a concept. That's still an idea. But anyway, again, let's end this segment. In the next segment, I do want to get a bit more philosophical, and we'll do that in a moment. I am speaking with Tom Sorrell and Stephen Lehart about the idea of scientism. What is it? What is it not? Is it good? Is it bad? And we started off speaking with some examples. We did some history. We got off on some digressions. I want to turn a little bit to a bit more philosophical ideas. And we were talking a little bit, or we sort of tiptoed around it, and that's the idea of the limits of knowledge and how this may play into scientism. There is in the negative sense of scientism the belief that nothing is beyond the power of science to know. If I love Susie with the red hair rather than Janice with the big breasts, there's a reason for why I love her beyond maybe preferring big breasts or to red hair or something. If she may have pheromones that are working on me, etc., etc. Do you think, both of you, that there are limits to knowledge in general, and also are there human limits to knowledge? And those are two different things. Stephen, if you want to take that first.
Yes, there are definitely limits to knowledge, but our very best bet to get the most knowledge we possibly can is by way of rational, reasonable inquiry. But for example, I think it's quite plain that our concept of time is totally different than time in the universe. In physics, time is a static dimension, that all of it exists all at once, and in our subjective time, we feel like we are living in a passing moment of time. There's obviously a disconnect there between reality and our understanding, and we will never really fully grasp those things, but we can come close to grasping them using the scientific method.
Well, before I let Tom answer, so I would take it you believe in the block universe.
Block universe? You mean
Yeah.
that
Everything is laid out from the beginning to the end, that with the proper knowledge and tools we could know, that there's going to be a hurricane in 3,300 years that's going to destroy Sao Paulo or the remains of it?
I think in theory that seems to make more sense, although I think it's rather interesting because there are two alternative views of time, and each of them can explain events in the world, but by very different means. One of them is that things are actually changing in time, and the other is that it's like a movie strip all laid out and all of it happened already, and we're just watching the movie strip frame by frame. That those two alternative explanations can each explain the universe, and yet one is very different than the other. I wonder whether they can both be right in some sense, just as a movie strip can be viewed through a projector in sequence, or it can be laid out on the table and viewed all at once. But I think that is definitely one of the limits of human knowledge.
Tom, what's your take on the limits of human knowledge?
Yeah, human knowledge has loads of limits. I mean, just to take very down-to-earth limits, it has. Probably a billion years ago, in where Tucson is now, we could ask a question. Were there ants in a particular position that's now occupied by some skyscraper in Tucson? We could ask that question, and it'd be simply impossible to know the answer to it. But that's not because it's conceptually impossible to get the answer. It's just because there's a sector that's just cut off from observation now, and it's one of those things we'll never know. That's just a humble example. When we come to the kinds of limits on knowledge that seem to me to be important to scientism, the kinds of examples that I would give would be the sorts of problems, these are the ones that are familiar to me in philosophy, the kinds of problems that people keep failing to solve, and that perhaps are impossible to solve, who knows. But here's a good example of one that I think is very much to the point. Before Descartes, but at the time of Descartes, it was possible to ask the question, can we prove that science, that's to say, some stable deductive deduction of general truths, is possible? That's a question that can be asked, and it can be asked on the basis of these skeptical thought experiments that Descartes ran. What if all conscious experience were a dream? What if we were constantly being deceived by a very powerful deceiver? Would that make science impossible? Now, that's a very good challenge to science still, because if you say that science can answer that question, you can see that the question at issue is being begged. What's at issue is whether science at all is possible, and it's question begging to say, here's a scientific answer to it. If there were a scientific answer to it, you'd be begging the question, so to speak. If you said, oh yes, science can answer everything, so it can answer this question, which is all to do with the possibility of science. That's an example of something where you'd have to presuppose the truth or the universal applicability of science in order to address the question that Descartes was addressing. And there might be other questions that are perennial problems in philosophy, like the question about free will versus determinism, where science might be inclined to stipulate something that might beg the question philosophically speaking. So that's an area where I think the resources of science are themselves in question, and there are no resources within science to show that the resources of science are beyond question. Those are the kinds of issues that I think pose the challenge directly and show where scientism is very likely to be found.
Well, Tom, since you mentioned it and following up on what Stephen had said, I'll just, before I go on to my next main question, I just wanted to follow up. Free will, then, would you say, I mean, if there is the block universe that everything's laid out, then free will obviously is impossible. Just like I've argued with a lot of theists that if God is all-knowing and omniscient, there's absolutely no way that you can have free will. And they, niggle and wiggle here and there. And I say, well, you're trying to redefine what omniscient is then. But is something like free will, the concept of agency, is that something that you think is an example of something that is beyond the limits of scientific knowledge? I'll start with Tom, then Stephen.
Well, there might be a residue of it that overlaps with the problem of consciousness. This is connected with the fact that agency has a sort of important first personal aspect to it. So agency is connected with this sense that we can be connected to things in the future by means of intention and by means of the processes that intention triggers, and that we sort of from a first person perspective can say what effects in the future they're going to be because we have the power to bring them about and we intend to. That's an aspect of agency that has this first personal side to it, and the first person is a kind of systematic maker of trouble for a scientific way of doing things, because the scientific way of doing things is essentially third personal, and one of its strengths is that it's essentially third personal. So I think agency. It's not that all of agency is impossible to talk about, but this first personal side of agency, there's a tendency for some people to say, oh, that's incidental, that's unimportant. And my sense is that the first person is quite important to what makes quite a few problems in philosophy problems. So I think, this is an area that's probably going to make trouble for science.
And that would be first personal things like qualia. Is a red stop sign the same red that for you as it is for me?
Yes, that's another aspect of the trouble made by the first person.
Yeah.
But in agency and intention, these things have a first personal aspect. And if they didn't, then the question of whether a machine or a robot could realize agency or have agency would be a lot simpler.
Stephen, do you have a response about free will and agency?
I have a panpsychic view of consciousness. I believe that since the human mind is nothing other, or I believe is nothing other than the physical activity of the physical brain, that already shows that a physical mechanism can, under certain circumstances, be conscious. I myself believe that even a simple thermostat has a consciousness of its own tension, that when you warm up the room, it feels an inclination to bend this way, and when you cool the room, it feels an inclination to bend that way. So if you ask the stupid thermostat, why did it turn the heat on, it doesn't say, I have no choice. It says, I felt like it was a good idea to do it because he feels it's forced subjectively. Now, as for the question of qualia, it's a very, very interesting issue. There are two aspects to our experience. For example, visual experience. We see the structure of the room around us. We see the shapes of things. And those are objective representations of the real room around you. But then there are the qualia, the subjective aspects, which have no correspondence to actual chromaticity of light. The color qualia are disconnected from physical reality that caused them. And in information theoretic terms, you can see that the shape of the room that you see around you is the information content of your consciousness. But the qualia, the raw colors of experience, those are a direct manifestation of the mechanism in your brain that's responsible for representing color. So the qualia have reality as a mechanism in the brain, but no reality as an object outside the brain.
Well, let me turn to another thing that's been mentioned a few times, I think mostly by Tom, and that's truth versus reality. I come, as I had mentioned earlier, from an arts background, and one of the things that makes me gnash my teeth is when people say art is truth. I'm like, art is not truth. If you just look at the root of the word art, it comes from artifice, and this, or the same place as artifice. And I often say that I think art helps translate reality, and to me, the easiest way to show that truth and reality are differences is if I point out, for example, that Dan Schneider is interviewing Stephen Lehar and Tom Sorrell on October 7th, 2016. That is the reality as we currently are speaking. It wasn't a reality a couple of hours ago. It won't be a reality in a couple of hours. But the statement that Dan Schneider is interviewing Stephen Lehar and Tom Sorrell on October 7th, 2016, is in and of itself true or false. And so truth or falseness is always a commentary on the deeper fundamental underlying reality. And I think one of the things that I've noticed just as a layman is that scientists sometimes mix up the idea of truth and reality. I think they are fundamentally different things for, as I've just said, truth or falseness are comments on reality. So let me start with you, Stephen. Do you think that some of what is colloquially called scientism, not your version, but colloquially, the negative sense, is based upon things like that, where people mix up ideas like truth and reality?
Well, this issue again reverts back to issues in perception. If you believe, as I do, that the world that you see around you is not the world itself, but is merely an image, a virtual reality replica of the world inside your head, then the issues of truth and reality come into stark contrast, because if you're having a lucid dream or a hallucination, you will see the same kind of world that you normally see around you, and yet that world is obviously untrue. So the world we see around us is only true in the sense that it is representative of the world that really is around us, which we cannot perceive directly. So I think the issues of truth go all the way back to the most fundamental issues of perception. When you perceive something, is it just something in your mind, or is it something in the outside world?
Tom?
Well, I think that sentences are probably the bearers of truth, and beliefs and so on are able to be bearers of truth to the extent they have content that's usually expressible in sentences. I think if you took all the true sentences there are, you'd probably have a description of reality with a couple of qualifications, because again, we'd probably have to be looking at a whole totality of sentences that were in the third person, that didn't contain relativizing words like here and now and this and I. We'd have to be talking about them roughly in the way you were talking about them, Dan. You know, you talk about interviewing Tom Sorrell and Stephen Lehar on the 7th of October 2016. That's the third person type of formulation of these truths. So I don't think that there's anything exotic about truth. You know, I think there can be very humdrum statements that are true in a very humdrum way. And if we're talking about, scientific versus ordinary, everyday humdrum truths, we'd be talking about, the generality of these statements and the way that they're involved in theories that have a certain mathematical structure and their predictive properties and so on. But basically, truth comes down to the way that sentences state things, the parts of the sentence refer to, and state that those things referred to are as they actually are. That's basically what truth is about. And I don't think reality is something that can't be reduced to truth. I think reality is just what the totality of these impersonally stated true sentences is.
Well, I want to just go off on something that Stephen had mentioned earlier. He seemed to iterate a belief that what we consider the cosmos is all the reproduction of the reality within his mind. And that brings up the sort of famous idea of the brain in the pan or the brain in the vat, depending on who uses the analogy. And I remember I've argued a few times with people. I said that, well, there's differences, for example, between the colloquial idea of a theory and a scientific theory. There's differences between, colloquial proof and scientific proof. And I would argue that, for example, if we can scientifically prove that plants exist, that plants act in this way, that there are stars, that there are galaxies, that there are cosmic laws, that there are this, that, and the other thing, and we have the weight of billions or trillions of scientific proofs, or true sentences, if you prefer, Stephen, that would argue against the brain in the pan, because a brain in the pan would be, by definition, a very limited thing and would not be able to concoct all the multifarious cosmic laws and things that are beyond even casual observation. The idea of the brain in the pan and scientific proof, can you prove the negative, as they say? I think you can, by weight of counter evidence. So let me just throw that out to both of you. I'll start with Stephen. Do you think that scientism, as you define it in the positive sense, can counter those people who would say, well, it's all just in the brain? Because you seem to be someone who would think that, yes, it might all be in the brain, but then you also think that you can prove it otherwise, unless I'm misreading you. So, Stephen, go ahead.
Well, I do believe that the whole world you see around you is an image inside your brain. And that itself demonstrates that if it's true, that your brain is first and foremost a three-dimensional imaging mechanism capable of generating three-dimensional real-time moving images as rich and complex as the world you see around you now. Now, if that is the case, then you're not seeing reality directly. It's like you're viewing a television monitor, much like this conversation here, where I feel like I'm in a room with Tom Sorrell, but I'm actually not. We're thousands of miles apart.
But do you think, though, that their scientific proofs could disprove the idea that everything, the whole matrix idea, for example, the weight of billions of proofs that all the stars and all the cosmic laws and evolution, etc., that can provide proof that there is an external reality besides that which you envision within your own mind?
I see. In other words, is there a way to know the ultimate truth about reality?
Yeah.
Can we know whether the external world exists or whether it has the properties that we perceive it to exist? And I think there are two answers to that. Solipsism, the idea that that your experience is all that exists, can never be disproven logically, and yet we all know that it's nonsense because we use a different method of reasoning than logic. We use a kind of holistic, intuitive method of reasoning, which I believe is valid for cases where you cannot use the more formal reasoning. And I would say that by circumstantial evidence, the world exists and has the properties that we presume it to exist, because the alternative explanation is so improbable that I choose not to believe it. That if your mind was so clever that it could imagine up an entire universe with all its laws and fool you into believing it was reality, that seems to me far more implausible than the fact that the universe really does exist out there, and my experience is an imperfect partial copy of parts of it.
Well, Stephen, though, so since if you're acknowledging that there are things beyond strict logical proofs, intuition or whatever you want to call it, then doesn't that then just nullify your idea of scientism as the only way? Because there's no way that we can prove Stephen Lehar's intuition is superior. Tom and I can't understand Stephen Lehar's intuition.
Well, I think that viewing science in the logical positive way is a mistake. That science is actually much broader than that. That, for instance, when I contemplate the Big Bang, my mind tells me that theory is so implausible, I have difficulty believing it. When I contemplate solipsism, I know it can't be logically disproven, but I am persuaded by the circumstantial evidence that the world exists and is generally the way we perceive it to be. These are knowledge or belief arrived at by a different means than the logical positive means. But I would say that that kind of thinking is still scientific thinking. I think wondering about the universe and wondering what it is and how it all fits together and trying to imagine it in your mind is, in my view, the most interesting and delicious part of science. The logical proofs are just the boring cleaning up the mess afterwards to prove it to the skeptics who don't see it right away.
Well, let me just ask, I'm sorry, Tom, I just want to continue with Stephen here because, well, how is that different, though, than the person who just came out of an 8-hour operation? They were dead for 3 minutes. They claimed they saw Jesus or God, and they have absolutely subjective proof that there's life after death, that we don't die, that God is grand and glorious and the creator and the fundaments of everything. Because I don't, what you're stating, your intuition, if you want to call it, I don't see much of a difference between that and the true believer.
Well, the thing about intuition is that I can have it and it can convince me, and that fellow can have it and it can convince him, but we cannot persuade other people with our intuition and our experience. We can try to appeal to their intuition,
Okay.
but if we fail, if we cannot appeal to their intuition, we can't prove it except by logical proof. But logical proofs can only be done on certain kinds of problems. Questions like, was there anything before the Big Bang, is not something that really can be logically proven. Neither can multiple universes. The very idea of a multiple universe is totally unverifiable. So it can't be disproven, but people of healthy intuition know that it's nonsense.
Tom, what is your take on the brain in the vat or the brain in the pan, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, I think that you have a couple of versions of this brain in the vat idea, and in Descartes, for example, he tries to do a reductio of something like that hypothesis, because he says, let's construct an environment in which it's extremely likely, because of my stipulations, that my beliefs are going to be false. Even in that environment, when I'm subject to demonic deception, there's one thing that I can be certain is true, and that's that if I think, therefore I am. That's what Descartes came up with. And in the sort of more modern types of discussions, one would probably try to meet the brain in the vat hypothesis with a sort of transcendental argument, namely, is it possible even to have thoughts with the content that I'm a brain in a vat, without, so to speak, disproving the hypothesis of the brain in the vat? Because how is it that I'm able to refer to brains in vats? How am I able to have thoughts with content if there are no causal relations between me and an external world in order to provide references for the elements of the content of my thought, or sentences or something like that? And that might be a transcendental argument that goes, because my thoughts have content, there must be a world outside me. So probably I'm not just a brain in a vat, and there's more to reality than this vat that my brain exists in. That's the way that the thing is usually done. And I think that that both of these strategies, the Cartesian strategy and this transcendental argument from content, both of these kinds of strategies have quite a lot to be said for them. I'm quite sympathetic to both of them from different directions. But notice that they're quite different from what Steve was proposing. Steve was sort of saying, it's very likely that there's an external world. That's an inference to the best explanation of my experience. What's the best explanation for my experience now? We could have an explanation that said, well, the world contains a lot of the things physics says it does, or we could have this rather more unusual explanation that I'm just a brain in a vat without much idea of what my environment are. But in that case, you'd have to explain all of the illusions that I have. How did these illusions about the contents of the world come into my mind? We're back in the area of the multiverse, right? Where in order to keep this thing going, you've got you've got to put so much stuff into the thought experiment that it's very hard to keep the suspension of disbelief going. And I think that's a rather different approach from the this logic chopping transcendental argument approach. And I kind of prefer the philosophical one because I think inference to the best explanation appeals to us partly because in a non-skeptically constituted universe, that's a good scientific procedure. But the whole point of the brain in the vat is to call in question the reliability of science. Maybe it's all just the deliverance of stimulation of a brain in a vat. So you can't use the inference to the best explanation to reassure ourselves that everything is roughly the way we think it is. I think you need these other more exotic ways of demonstrating things that I've just given you examples of from Descartes and from transcendental arguments.
An inference to the best explanation for lay people is probably best known as Occam's razor, correct?
Well, Occam's razor is about simplicity. So the inference to the best explanation could be the best explanation where the best explanation is not necessarily the simplest one.
All right.
But it depends.
Okay.
Yeah, they're related.
Yeah. So let me, I want to end this interview, but and we'll have a final segment where I give you both chances to sum up your thoughts. But let me end with a final question or posit for this segment. And we sort of talked about this, but there's a branch in the last 20 or 30 years of philosophy, I guess you would call it, called New Mysterianism, which basically deals with dualism and the mind-body problem. And it's sort of, in the last 25 years in popular culture, also been taken out of that context to try to explain other things beyond the limits of science. The idea of New Mysterianism basically being that that there are limits to human knowledge, and there are numbers of people in different branches of the sciences. Do you, let me start with Tom, and then I'll go to Stephen. Tom, would you say that New Mysterianism is a form of scientism, or is that just basically a proper portion of philosophy?
Well, I think that New Mysterianism is anti-scientistic because it's basically saying something is going to remain a mystery. For instance, in the original form of this kind of doctrine, the evolution of consciousness might be regarded as a mystery, or the relationship of consciousness to the brain might be regarded as a mystery. And when one uses that term mystery, we mean inaccessible to our kind of mind, or our kind of mind with concepts. So it's a mystery. It's something that's inscrutable, out of bounds to science, therefore. So it's anti-scientistic. It's saying there are mysteries, there are things we'll never be able to penetrate, and consciousness is one of them. So I think it's anti-scientistic. I'm only sympathetic to it in the sense that in the commonplace sense that what its likeness of consciousness is a little bit hard to reduce to anything else. It's a little hard to explain. It's a little hard to constitute. If that's what Mysterianism is, I'm sure it's a more pretentious doctrine than that. But that's the truth in Mysterianism, that there's something ineffable about consciousness. Anyway, it's not scientific. That I'm sure of.
Stephen, how about you?
When scientists reach a profound mystery, they are tempted to turn Mysterian and say that the mystery is fundamental and is profound and is inescapable, and they solve the problem by building the mystery into their own theory. A perfect example is the theory of direct perception. People who believe that we can see the world directly out where it lies beyond the sensory surface. And when challenged with things like, well, the retina looks like a photosensor array and the optic nerve sends the image up to the brain, they say, no, you can see the world directly out where it lies, and that's the mystery of consciousness. But the mystery can be resolved if you once recognize the fact that the whole world you see around you, every part of it, is actually inside your head, which means that the head that you have come to know as your own is not your true physical head. but merely a perceptual replica of your head inside a perceptual replica of the world, all of which is contained inside your true physical head. So beyond the farthest things you can perceive in all directions is the inner surface of your true physical skull. And beyond that skull is an unimaginably immense external world, of which all this that you see here is a miniature internal replica. If you acknowledge this idea, the mystery of consciousness disappears. We are conscious of things when the image of them appears in our mind, and our mind is this space that we're in right here, and whether or not that relates to something that also exists in the external world is something that needs to be verified by checking first to see whether you're asleep and dreaming. But I think that theories that insert mystery into the theory itself are caught out trying to dodge the mystery, which actually has a more reasonable explanation.
Well, let's end this segment here, and when we get back, I'll give you both a chance to sum up your ideas on scientism and other things. So we'll do that in a moment. I am speaking of Scientism with Stephen Lehart and Tom Sorrell. I will link below this video to both of their web pages that you can read more about them or contact them if you wish. Stephen and Tom have slightly different ideas about what scientism is, pro or con. Let me just give them both a minute or two or whatever they need to sum up any ideas or any other points I may not have gotten to. Stephen, you first. Any final thoughts?
Yeah. Science and religion seem initially to be like polar opposites. One believes in discovered knowledge, evidenced by the world. The other believes in revealed knowledge. So they seem like polar opposites. And yet at the same time, science and religion have much in common because both have carefully crafted systems of thoughts and a large literature recording them, and both are committed, at least supposedly, to discovering the real truth behind experience. But in fact, science can actually be seen as the latest generation of faith, the most reasonable, logical religion. And in fact, there is a certain amount of faith that is required in science as well. You must believe in the utility of science. You must believe in the existence of an external world. You must believe that that world is amenable to understanding in logical terms. And if you believe all these things, then you're able to do science. Now, scientism is the belief that this method of skeptical inquiry, which has been so successful over the centuries, is the most reliable path to the truth. Not necessarily the only path to the truth, but it is the most reliable path to the truth. And whenever there's a conflict between science and faith, I will believe the results of science. Much of the criticism of scientism is because is of an exclusionary scientism that says only scientific or logical positive statements are valid. That's going too far. Science is one of many tools that we have for understanding the universe, but I do believe, and this is my personal belief, is that it is the most reliable path to the truth. I can't prove it to anyone else. I appeal to your intuition to either believe my belief or not believe my belief.
And you'd also need to have faith in your own ability to accurately gather and collate the facts that are gathered.
Yeah.
Tom, what is your final thoughts on scientism, pro or con, either Stephen's version of it or the more colloquial?
Yeah, I think I want to be con scientism, certainly. The main pitch I wanted to make is that there are types of understanding, types of knowledge that are autonomous of science and that are reliable. And I gave as examples mathematics and some parts of philosophy. We could talk about logic. We could talk about the overlap between logic, mathematics, and philosophy. Those parts that overlap, I'd be prepared to defend as quite reliable, quite systematic, quite open to investigation, quite defensible. And the idea that natural science is actually capable of answering the questions that those bits of learning are able to answer, that is the claim I reject. I think that mathematics, philosophy and science are often compatible, consistent, but different approaches to understanding reality. And there are lots of other approaches we haven't discussed at all today: history, literature. These can be ways of finding out things about the world, mainly the human world, that are okay in their way. I don't want to denigrate them. I don't want to denigrate other kinds of humanities and arts. But I don't think that that's the issue with scientism. The issue with scientism is statements that you get from people like Stephen Hawking saying, physics is dead, and philosophy is dead, and physics can answer all the questions there are, and people who say similar things. That's the attitude that I think, even in this day and age, we should be suspicious of.
Well, again, I want to thank both of you for your time. I will link to both of your web pages below this video. People who have enjoyed the conversation or learned something can find out more and contact you possibly down there. So again, thanks for your time and expertise.